We're very excited to have here today. Your slides look great, Susannah. Susannah Krysko, who is a community and urban IPM specialist with the Cornell Integrated Pest Management Program. And she's going to be talking with us today about IPM for clothes moths. So thank you, Susannah.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. This was a fun presentation to put together because I even learned a few things. I am happy to be here talking to you today, but I always like to start my presentations off with a little review of what IPM and a reminder that integrated pest management is a strategy. It's not one way of doing things. It's not, one prescribed way of doing things without pesticides. It's a strategy that kind of follows the same cyclical process each time you use it. We start with inspecting and monitoring. We correctly identify the pest, which is going to come into play when we talk about the clothes moths. And you scale the response. So if I have one moth flying around, I have different controls that I'm going to use as opposed to thousands of moths flying around. Um, you then use multiple tools. The reason for this is we cannot rely on chemical pesticides alone to handle every pest for various reasons, resistance and exposure and various things. And then you evaluate your success. So you've used several different tools, you've tried different methods. Did they work? How do you know that? Well, you inspect and monitor again. If the pests are gone, they worked. If they didn't, if your pests are not gone, you have to try some other strategy. So there's two types of clothes moth that we're concerned about in New York State. We have both of them. The webbing moth might be a little more common, Tiniola bacilliella, and that's the webbing clothes moth. And the case-making clothes moth, Tinea pellionella, are both about the same size. They're about 5 to 7 millimeters long, and they're both very shy. They're not like a type of moth that you see flying around, like maybe your pantry moths flying around everywhere. They kind of, just keep uh, only come out at night, and they're stay in the closets and in those dark places. Um, they both share some common characteristics. So let me go back and show you. See the fringes on their wings? That is really distinctive of a clothes moth. They both share that characteristic. They both also share that cute little mohawk. I have to move my face. Okay. So they both have a tuft of hair that kind of resembles a punk rock mohawk. And they both have these downward pointing palps, their mouth parts with lateral bristles. This is different than a grain moth that would have curved palps. So here's the star of the show, the webbing clothes moth. You can see some of an adult there with the beautiful golden shiny wings and the larvae and the frass. These guys also, it's hard to see here because this material that they're consuming is white, but you can see some of the webbing as well, which is very distinctive of the webbing clothes moth. The webbing clothes moth do not wear a case. That is the big difference that you'll see, very obvious. They're always naked. I just thought that was funny when I read that description. Like we don't think about a caterpillar being naked, but these guys do not wear a case. So there you have the adult and the larvae. And that's what the webbing will look like in your carpet or your sweaters. They don't carry that webbing around with them. They put that webbing there to, they might be under the webbing, protected and feeding, but they don't carry it around with them. They'll leave and then move along and make new webbing. The other thing you see there is the frass. So the frass will change color depending on what they're consuming. Now, the case-making clothes moth is a little duller, same size, fringed wings, but the coloring is duller, and sometimes they have a dark spot on their wings. They look pretty different, but they can be mistaken for one another. And here's the case maker. The case maker making clothes moth larvae is never without that case. And the case is usually representative of whatever they're consuming too. Um, Yeah, that sky is feeding on. Well, okay, so now there's a different, this is still the case maker, but the case can look quite different depending on what they're using for their materials to create that case. Um, the case making clothes moth, another really distinctive difference is they dangle their pupa from a surface, usually over a food source. So they climb up and they pupate on things that they can hang from. This can get confusing because they also make a little bit of webbing when they do this, so you might get confused. However, the pupae of the case makers are always going to be above the food choice, and the webbing moth is going to pupate in their food source, so in the fabric that they're eating. Um, I forgot to mention that they typically, well, I think I talk about it in the next slide. So what makes them a pest? Um, they will eat the keratin in natural fibers like wool, silk, feathers, and fur. Usually this happens with stuff that we've stored for a while. It can be a huge problem in museums with museum collections that are, not disturbed for long periods of time. They can be really attractive food sources. Each moth can lay up to 100 eggs. So, of course, a good population, good reproductive strategy always is a uh, common characteristic of a pest species. So that moth can lay up to 100 eggs. It's a lot of babies. And the eggs are very tiny, about a millimeter long, and they lay them within the natural fibers. It makes the eggs very hard to see, so it's not like something you could scout out and find and remove the eggs. The eggs hatch very quickly when it's warm enough, between 4 and 10 days, a little bit longer, like 3 weeks and during the winter. The thing that I think is really nuts about this, about the clothes moth, is the larval stage can last 2 to 30 months. So that's almost 2.5 years of the larva eating the fabric. So that's why they can do some really significant damage. I don't know why, maybe it's weather, maybe it's temperature that keeps them in this larval state. Then they go into the cocoon and they hatch out as a moth. And again, the adult moths, they don't feed. Their whole purpose is to reproduce. It's the larval stage that creates the damage. And here's an example of some of the damage that we often see, just holes, and that's often the first clue that you have a clothing moth. So how do we prevent and control them? So we've scouted, we've identified we have a moth consuming our fabrics. What do we do? Well, the first thing we want to do, of course, is identify the correct species. And I'm going to get a little more into that, why that's so important when I talk about pheromone traps. You can wash things that are washable, can be washed in hot water, even 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or dried in a hot dryer. 30 minutes on high usually is a good recommendation to follow. But most of the things that these guys are eating, like wool and silk, you might not want to expose to high heat. So you can dry clean items, but even dry clean only items you can actually put in the dryer, as long as that won't affect the quality. You can steam clean, or you just use a clothing steamer because they get quite hot. You can hang small carpets or throw rugs outside and beat them and brush them and try to remove the eggs and larvae by hand. And of course, the most important thing is, when things are clean, you store them in totes, not bags. Oh no. Well, you can store them in bags actually, but store them in totes or bags as long as they're sealed. So bags are fine as long as they're sealed. Vacuum sealed bags is even better. You can also freeze items. This is what I did when I uncovered a bunch of them in some yarn that I had stored and hadn't touched in probably years. Most of it I had to throw out, but if I found any that I wanted to keep, I put it in the freezer. It has to be at least 72 hours and definitely freezing temperatures. Vacuuming the closet and your storage area is really important because you can get rid of a lot of the live moths, the eggs that are just hanging around. And then you want to discard that vacuum bag or whatever was in the canister of your vacuum somewhere outside. Bag it and put it outside so you don't want them reinfesting. And then checking that stored clothing and fabric items regularly. If you put stuff in the attic and you just forget about it, well, there's a good chance that they'll find it. So checking, making sure that you don't have these pests is really important. And then for a really serious infestation, say you have something, an antique rug or furniture that is infested, and you're just having a lot of trouble, nothing you do works, there is a time and a place to call a professional. And sometimes these cases can go on for a very long time. Trying to find the source and getting rid of them all, it can be a challenge. It's not always a DIY job. So the pheromone traps, knowing the species is really important for these guys because pheromones are, the attractant that are specific to each species. So they're communicating with each other, and it's very species specific. The webbing clothes moth pheromone at first will attract the case maker, but then when they get closer, it's actually a repellent. And the webbing clothes moth is not attracted to the case maker pheromone at all. So they're not interchangeable. So really knowing which one you have is really important because of the expense of the pheromone traps. I think I was reading there's various companies that make them, but one of the companies just for example, there was 10 pheromone traps, 10 vials of this pheromone for $90. So you really want to, if you're going to invest that, you want to know what you have. Furthermore, where you place the trap matters as well because the case makers are more often flyers. So these hanging traps, the wing traps, they called them, are really more useful for the case makers because they're flying around. Now, the webbing moth, moth, the adult, is more of a crawler. They'll crawl on the floor, they'll crawl on the shelves. So that's why these some of the traps that I'm showing you, you can do either. You can hang them or you can place them on a flat surface. But some are made specifically for what? One is this, that's the webbing clothes moth. You can kind of tell because it's a trap that is on a flat surface, but also from that golden color. And then you have other ones that you would, hang in your closet. So they're really good monitoring tools. They wouldn't work as a standalone control because they're just attracting the adults and there's no impact on the eggs or the larva. So you have to use several different methods and not just rely on the traps. The traps aren't going to fix the whole problem. There is a biocontrol, very cool. And this, the quote I have from the Bugs for Bugs founder, that is a company that sells these little trichogramma wasps that are very tiny, and their whole point is to parasitize moth eggs. And they are so small that you wouldn't even know that they were, if you released them in your house, you probably wouldn't even know that they are there. The quote is, you can fit a half a dozen on a pinhead and still have room to spare. They're very tiny, and maybe a technique that would be more appropriate for a museum or something with a collection that we're trying to save long term. What about deterrents and repellents? Well, the smells fade, and we cannot guarantee that these will work. With cedar, a lot of people use cedar, and certainly it's worth a try. If you like the smell of cedar, certainly use it. I'm not trying to discourage you. A lot of people use cedar chests, but these pieces of cedar that you just hang in the closet or put in your drawers, once the smell fades, they really don't do much for repellents, and they do nothing to repel the eggs or the larvae. You could maybe scuff up the cedar periodically, but most people would forget about that. If it was going to, it would work the best in an enclosed situation but as long as it's closed up and sealed, then there's not much of a chance that the moths will get in anyway. Pesticide sprays and bug bombs, they actually don't kill the eggs or even reach the larvae. So they're kind of pointless and just not usually, you won't usually find them labeled for clothes moths. People always ask me about lavender and other essential oils. Same thing, they may work temporarily to repel the adults, but they're not going to be a long-term fix. But yeah, maybe they would make your clothing smell nice. Mothballs are the classic. We know that people use them for various other things. That's why I spoke about this, I think, last year at the What's Bugging You First Friday, and I really stressed that they're not used for snakes, spiders, squirrels, or any other animal except for moths. They're pesticides. A lot of people don't consider them, they think they're safe. They don't think about them as pesticides, and they slowly give off a toxic gas that kills the insect. So if you're breathing that in, you're also breathing in that pesticide. And they usually contain naphthalene or paradichlorobenzene. And you would want to think twice before you put those in your home in a situation where they're not enclosed. Any situation where you're smelling it, you are breathing in the pesticide. And it's a pesticide that you can become poisoned and suffer from some impacts from breathing in too much mothball. This was right from Amazon website. In their description, they said mothballs for rodents, which is not on the label. So, you know, you got to be careful where you're buying things and always read the label. Don't trust Amazon. So if you use mothballs, airtight spaces, not bags, not around food or food preparation areas, not outside. There's someone that lives near my parents that loads up the outside of their house with mothballs, and you can smell mothballs outside, even in, you know, I'm just walking by the house and I can smell it. I can't imagine what it's like for the people that live there, let alone the wildlife and the soil contamination, the water contamination, and all that. And then a very important thing is wash your clothing if they've been stored with mothballs before wearing, because they still have the pesticides on them. And before using any pesticide, read that label thoroughly. Don't apply a pesticide to a carpet or upholstery unless that is specifically listed on the label. So the alternatives, kind of reviewed these already, but just if you don't want to use mothballs, there are great alternatives. The vacuum, laundering, dry cleaning, airtight storage, brushing and beating, freezing, pheromone sticky traps, and again, don't depend on the cedar. There's no evidence that these sonic repellent devices work. Don't waste your money. And then finally, prevention is really important. How do you not get clothes moths? Well, you can rotate your clothing, avoid leaving anything undisturbed for a long period of time. Like remember the story with the yarn that I had for a really long time. If I'm not going to do anything with that yarn, I should probably give it away or discard it because otherwise it's just going to attract more pests. Inspect those things that you're storing regularly. Look for holes. If you can detect a hole early on, you can prevent major damage. If you can detect an infestation early on. And then proper cleaning. If you know, you might have, unbeknownst to you, vacuum or clean your closets regularly and have eliminated a population or some of a population just by regular cleaning. And if you plan on storing something long term, you want to store it clean. So freeze it first or launder it first to make sure that you're not storing it with eggs or larvae. And my last slide is just to show you the difference side by side as we get ready for Regina's grain moth talk. You can see that these guys are very different. They're very distinctive. So just want to show them side by side because they're two moths that you find inside. You might get them confused. And that's all I have. And I think we're doing good on time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susannah. Um, but here's one question that came in. What about bulk raw fiber? will freezing still be sufficient because of the larger volume? Or maybe do you have any thoughts about like the volume of what you're freezing and how long it needs to be frozen? Does that change on volume?
That is a good question. First, obviously the space requirement that you would need. We know that chest freezers are much more reliable as far as temperature, and well, they also have more capacity, but they can reach those lower temperatures. So I would say in any situation where you're freezing, maybe putting the thermometer, a freezer thermometer in the middle of what you're trying to freeze, so you know that that temperature is getting cold enough in the middle and it's not, protected. Yeah, because wool by nature is insulating, right? And again, like we get some pretty cold temperatures. I don't know about you guys, but it was about 5 degrees last night at my house. You could technically kill something in very cold weather, but you would need the thermometer to guarantee that temperature reached that low of a temperature in the parts that you are trying to impact. That makes sense.
And do you know how long it has to stay at a freezing temperature?
At least 72 hours. I don't think anyone's really studied this, exactly or done long-term studies, but we typically say with other bugs, as well as the clothing moths, 72 hours, 3 days at least. So if you're really concerned, keep it in longer.
Great, thank you. I know there are some more questions in the chat. If you have time to answer them, great. Otherwise, we will address them. We'll send them to you after the meeting. If you want to stop sharing your slides, I'll ask Regina to pull her slides up and we'll have our IPM minute. So our IPM minute speaker today is Regina Clinton. She's a community and urban IPM specialist with the Cornell Integrated Pest Management Program. And she will be talking with us today about IPM for pantry moths.
Okay, thank you, Amara, for welcoming me here to talk about pantry moths. So this is going to be a very abbreviated talk on what you can do so that you can quickly identify things that are within your toolbox that you can take care of these pests. It's certainly not an easy chore. I don't know anyone who has not at one time or another experienced having these pantry moths. So we're going to talk about inspecting for them, knowing what to look for, how to eliminate them, and secure your food goods. Pantry moths are part of a greater portion of pests that affect the home and the things that we have stored products. So this is the Dirty Dozen that Insect Limited posted, and we're talking primarily about the Indian meal moth. And we have a ton of resources about other pests that you might encounter. So here's a QR code that will take you directly to that. So the key to managing pantry moths are a few key steps. So inspect for the damage so you know what you're looking for, right? Because often you see the damage before you ever see the moth. So that could be the webbing that you find or leftover frass or maybe pupal cases. Those are all things. Then you want to identify it and eliminate those food sources and prevention. These are the areas we're going to talk about. So when we're looking for pantry moths, so we want to look for areas where dried food products are, processed foods. So any of those areas where you might have pasta or cereal or nuts or dried fruits. But you also want to think about areas where you might have bird seed stored or dog food or pet food in different areas. And then also even dried flowers. So this is some of the evidence that you would expect to find if you're looking for pantry moths. And we're going to be looking primarily at the Indian meal moth, which is this culprit here, because that's the largest pest problem in homes is this Indian meal moth. While there are other moths, essentially everything that we're going to say would be applicable to them as well. So if you see the evidence and you happen to have a moth in your cupboard or wherever you found it, you want to then try and identify it because as Susannah mentioned, you need to be able to know how to treat for it. Whether if you're selecting to use a pheromone to attract these. But your local extension office is a great place to start. Monroe County has a diagnostic lab. Cornell has one as well. So there are multiple options, but you can also use where you find the organism. So is it in a pantry? Is it in an area where these foods that they seek are located? That can kind of give you an indication that you have a pantry moth instead of a clothes moth. So those are kinds of some things that you as a homeowner can use to determine what you might have. You might also just use a hand lens that you have, or something like that that might be lying around, a magnifying lens to help you decide, okay, is it a pantry moth or is it a clothing moth? And obviously, the better thing is to submit a sample so it can be identified at one of these areas that are mentioned. And then once you have identified that you do have these organisms, it's important that you throw away all the food, because if you're trying to save, you're just going to end up with future infestations that you have to deal with. So a lot of times you'll see these little teeny tiny holes that are around, but make sure you discard it. And all the food should then go out of the house. So put it on the curbside. Don't keep it in the house. It's important to get rid of those products. And then you want to make sure that you're vacuuming all those cracks, crevices, hard to reach spots, because what happens is when those larvae pupate, they move away from the food source and they end up, trying to get it a secure spot in these cracks and crevices. So you want to make sure that you're sucking them out with those attachments on your vacuum that would allow you to get in those cracks and crevices, and then wipe down the cabinets. So this here actually was one of those areas where the larva had pupated in the top of my cabinet that's above the stove that I very rarely go in. But I did have some old flour that was in the back that I hadn't put in the freezer like I should to keep it safe. So it's also important that you remember to always throw out any waste that you have from these. The same applies for your vacuum so that you get rid of the pests that are in there. And then it's also important to remember that you might not always have the food sources that they're looking for in an easy to access place that you can get to. So it might be in the attic or it might be in a wall void. So, you see these pantry moths around, but, what is the source? You have to eliminate the source in order to control them. So sometimes it requires greater detective work, just like this instance. This came in to the diagnostic lab where a homeowner said, I don't know where these insects are coming from. Well, they did a bit more investigating, and it wasn't in the pantry. It was actually underneath the cabinet of the bathroom, right? Because when we look at the label, we see that there's wheat bran and red X. So it's important that you're being a good detective. If you're not getting rid of the solution, it's not always right in front of our face. We need to look elsewhere. And then the fourth and final step is talking about prevention. Keep your products in airtight, thick-walled glass and plastic containers, and always use a first in, first out. And make sure you're dating your containers. So you're using the oldest material first. It's important to not store it for long periods of time. And then try and purchase only quantities that you can use within a couple week time frame. And if you're not going to, if you're maybe a baker or something, maybe freeze that extra portion, because do you really need a large quantity? And then improve your sanitation, meaning check your cabinets continually, do that kind of spring cleaning at least monthly, or, clean up those spills that you might have. So like I was mentioning, that cabinet above my stove has flour in it, and it's higher. So I don't always look at it, and which is why I had the pantry moths in mine. And then always continue to monitor for any evidence of pests. And so, how do you recognize whether this might be a clothing moth or a pantry moth? Well, look at the habitat. Where did you find it? Was it in the kitchen or pantry, close to those dried goods products? That could be a hint. Or was it in a more secluded area where they don't have access to those things? And then remember the differences in the food sources and, where you might see them. So if you see moths flying toward the light, there's a good chance it's probably one of those pantry moths because the clothing moths avoid light. And as always, thank you. If you want more information, there's a great What's Bugging You First Friday that Dr. Jody Gangloff Kaufman did. And we have a link here to that.